welcome to my first YouTube video. So today I'm going to be talking about my story and what happened to me and why I'm in a wheelchair. And so basically this story starts in 2007. I was 9 years old and I wanted to go on a trip to Africa. And you might be thinking, why Africa? Well, I have an aunt who is a missionary and she's been going to Africa since I think her first time she went was in the 90s or something. And so I wanted to go to Africa and spend a year over there to get some world experience and see what it was like in a third world country. And so I told my grandma this because my grandma would make frequent trips to Africa, and she told me to plant a seed and trust that God would provide the trip to Africa for me. And so I took a penny and I planted a seed, and I think it was like a week later or less than a week later, my grandma ended up calling me and inviting me to go spend a year in Africa. And so of course I was ecstatic, as I had just barely planted that seed and God was already answering my prayer. And so we start planning the trip to go to Africa. I had to get my passport, I had to get clothes, and we start getting everything in order. And I think it was like a few weeks before the trip, I started feeling kind of sick. And when I was younger, I was notorious for getting strep throat. And so, I had asked my mom to take me to the doctor. And so we went to the doctor, they tested me for strep throat, and the test came back negative. And so we were like, okay, so I didn't know what was going on, but I just really didn't feel good. I was very lethargic and just tired all the time, and I felt really awful. And so then I think a week passed and I was still feeling really sick, and so I asked my mom to take me to the doctor again. And so she took me to the doctor again. They tested me for strep throat again. The test came back negative again. And so we went ahead and proceeded with the plan to go to Africa. So I ended up going with my grandma, my grandpa, and their friends, Judy and Jerry. So we left to Africa on April 4th, 2007. And the flight to Africa from where I live, Texas, it took us 2 days. So we flew from Houston, Texas to somewhere in Colorado, I believe, but we didn't get off the plane there. We just picked up some more people, I believe. And then from there we went to London, and then in London we had an 8-hour layover, so we hung out in the airport. And then from London we went to Entebbe, Uganda, and that is where we met my aunt and my cousins, Rhea and Sarah. I think we spent the first week in Entebbe, and then we went to Luero, where my aunt lived at the time. And I remember when we got there, I told my grandma that I was still having a sore throat. I still didn't feel good. And, my grandma could tell that I wasn't my normal self on the whole trip to Africa. And so she looked at my throat and it was really red, and so they ended up getting me some antibiotics. But in Africa it works a little differently. And so in America you typically take antibiotics for 10 days, but in Uganda I only took the antibiotics for 5 days. And so I don't know if that had anything to do with it, or if it wasn't antibiotics that I needed. At this point, there's no way of knowing, but I did take the antibiotics for 5 days, but actually pretty quickly, I started losing sensation. And so I remember I first lost sensation in my stomach, and so my stomach went numb. And I think my legs went next. But it started in the middle. And I don't know if that means anything, but that's how it started for me. And on April 19th of 2007, I woke up in the middle of the night and I just had this horrible, horrible pain in my upper back and my neck. And I was crying, and my grandma came into my room because I kept waking up my cousins, who were really little at the time. I don't know exactly how old they were, but they were toddlers, and I kept waking them up because I was crying. So my grandma came into my room trying to get them to settle back down, and she thought that maybe I was in pain because my bed was hard, because beds over there typically are harder than beds in America. And so she offered for me to come sleep in her bed because she would always take something to make her bed softer. And so I got out of bed, I took 3 steps, and I fell to my hands and my knees, and I couldn't get back up again, no matter how hard I tried. And I was kind of groggy, and so it didn't really occur to me that, hey, this is kind of weird. And so then she called my grandpa into the room, and he grabbed me under my arms and carried me down the hallway and put me in my grandma's bed. And I remember when he was carrying me down the hallway, I was trying as hard as I could to get my feet to take steps, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it to save my life. And so he placed me in my grandma's bed, and, I was gonna go back to sleep. And I remember I was trying to roll over, and I couldn't get my body to roll over. And my grandma noticed that, and this is whenever she was kind of like, okay, this is not okay. Something's wrong. We need to take her to the hospital. And so she got my family up, and they got me dressed, and we went to the nearest hospital, which was a bush hospital. So it was really small. It was just for the small community around there. And the electricity at the hospital was out that night. And so at this point, I'm completely out of it. I'm hallucinating. I'm seeing things. We didn't know it yet, but it was because my brain was swelling. And so I remember seeing spiders on the wall and just all kinds of weird stuff. And so the doctor at the Bush Hospital performed a spinal tap, but because the electricity was out, he had to do it by flashlight, which apparently is kind of crazy. And so he did the spinal tap, and he found that my spinal fluid was not right. Something was wrong with it. And so then they rushed me to Kampala International Hospital, which was the big hospital that foreign people go to. And so they rushed me there, and it was a whole crazy experience that I don't necessarily remember all of it. I remember bits and pieces, but I've been told the story many times. So I spent the first 8 days in ICU because they were worried that the paralysis was going to spread to my lungs and that I wouldn't be able to breathe. I would need to be put on a respirator to breathe for me, or whatever machine breathes for you. And also they were worried because my brain was swelling. They were worried that that they were going to have to drill a hole into my skull to relieve the pressure. And so the medication that I needed to stop the paralysis. I want to say it was called like immunoglobulin or something like that, but don't quote me. But that medication, first of all, was like nowhere in the USA, so thank God I was in Africa. But it also wasn't in the country that I was in, Uganda, but they randomly found like 3 vials or bottles of it randomly at a small pharmacy in the middle of Kenya, which is the country right next to Uganda. And so then they had to try and get the medication from that small pharmacy in Kenya to Kampala in Uganda, where I was, in order to stop this paralysis from progressing. And so from what I was told, it was a crazy whirlwind experience trying to get that medication, because the people said that the village that by the pharmacy, or that the pharmacy was in, you couldn't be there past a certain time because the people would get violent at night or something like that. And so there was a man that went and got the medication, and then there was like a plane, but the pilot wouldn't put it on the plane because he didn't know what was in the box. And it was a whole complicated situation, and it had to have been orchestrated by God, because that's the only way that they were able to get this medication to me, because nobody wanted to take it. They didn't know what it was. They didn't even know me, and so they ended up, through God somehow, they ended up getting the medication to me, and they gave it to me, and things started to turn around pretty quickly. They didn't have to drill a hole into my skull. The progression of the paralysis stopped. And so it was looking good. Like, the medication was what basically saved me. And so after those 8 intense days in ICU, which, by the way, I was completely out of it this whole time because of my brain, and I was seeing things like, my mom was still in Texas, and I thought I saw her at one point. I would see flower petals falling on people's heads. There was a point where it occurred to me that I was gonna have to have a wheelchair, and I saw someone bring in a pink one and a blue one, and I chose the blue one because I was a tomboy and I was not gonna have a pink wheelchair. And so after they got me that medication, all the hallucinating stopped, but the paralysis that had already progressed remained. The damage was already done, and they diagnosed me with bacterial meningitis and Guillain-Barré syndrome. And basically, the way they explained it to me is that the nerves, all your nerves, they have this protective coating of fat around them called myelin sheath, and that protective layer of fat insulates your nerves so that the nerves can conduct electricity through them. They basically explained it's like a cord, like a charger cord or something. It's got a coating around it, but all the wires that are conducting the electricity are in the middle. That's your nerves, and the myelin sheath is that protective coating. And that's what was damaged for me, was just that protective coating. And so my nerves weren't able to fire correctly anymore because of that protective coating being gone. Now, I was told that myelin sheath can actually regenerate, but that it regenerates very slowly. And so at this point, I was paralyzed from the neck down at first, but after those 8 days of the ICU and after the medication, I had regained my right arm. My left arm was still weak. I can't remember if I could move it at all, but I remember we had to rest it on a pillow a lot. So I'm not really too sure about that. But then, from the waist down, everything was completely paralyzed. And so after those 8 days in ICU, I ended up staying in the hospital in a regular room for 2 more weeks. And then after those 2 weeks, we stayed at a guest house for 2 more weeks. And then we ended up coming back to the States. So it was out of my year-long trip that I was supposed to be in Africa. I ended up staying a total of 7 weeks. And then I had to come back home. And once I got back home, I, was making pretty good progress. Things were recovering pretty quickly, but there was a certain point where it just kind of stopped, and I was left with paraplegia. And so at this point now in my life, it's been 13 years since that happened. I've been in a wheelchair for 13 years. And my right hand is totally fine, my right arm. My left hand, just the hand, is still partially paralyzed, so my coordination isn't as good with this hand, and my sensation is not 100% with this hand. And then in my legs, I have some movement, and I have some sensation in pretty much all parts of my body, but sometimes someone will touch me and I won't notice it, or it really just depends on like the touch or whatever. But I did find out a few years ago that my injury was incomplete, which means that I do have a better chance at recovery. And so, I've been working here recently. I've been crawling. I'm working on getting back into physical therapy. I've been working on my muscles, and and also praying and putting my faith in God that, Jesus took the stripes for my healing, and I believe that and I receive that. So, I've been wanting to do a YouTube channel for a long time about just what it's like to be in a wheelchair and to be disabled, and the different things that you face with having a disability and the different way that I do things. And so that's pretty much what I'm going to be talking about on here. And I appreciate your support. So if you want to subscribe, that would be really cool. If you would like to learn about, what it's like to be in a wheelchair, like the different things that you have to do and the ways you work around stuff, then that would be something that you could subscribe to find out about. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed hearing my story. If you or anyone you know has gone through anything similar, I'd love to hear about it, because it's super cool to hear about other people who have gone through things similar to me. So you can comment and share this video, and I super appreciate the support, and I will see you on the next video. Okay, bye.